on to Jerusalem.
There are huge arguments right across the range of the leaders, all the way through different levels of the army, about where the Crusade should go next. Should they immediately try to march on Jerusalem? Should they recover their strength? How long should they wait? What route should they take? And the potential is for the army to literally just fall apart, to go into different directions, for people to start returning home, to lose their impetus entirely. And it comes very close to this.
As the Crusade leaders squabbled, the troops demanded that the army march southward to Jerusalem. To them, the true goal of the Crusade had been forgotten. Their anger and frustration finally boiled over in a small town 2 days' ride from Antioch, called Marat al-Numan.
So this is where the legacy of the First Crusade really took place. I think it's a landmark for any historian to visit this place. This is where the First Crusader really made their violent legacy.
It would be here the Christians would commit the most evil atrocity of the Crusade. This is Dr. Taif Al-Azari's first visit to Marat al-Numan, the site of the most shocking atrocity of the First Crusade. Tucked away in the northwest corner of Syria, this 11th century citadel has been all but forgotten. Its ruins are now little more than a playground to the children who emerged to shadow his tour.
I think we are really making our way into the citadel of Ma'arat, and to the left the remains of the mosque, and to the right hand the remain of the little palace for the ruler of the city. Probably this was a church serving the Christian population of Ma'arat and Nu'man, who were living peacefully side by side with their fellow Muslims. And of course the Crusaders were really indiscriminate about killing all the inhabitants of Ma'ara, regardless of their faith or their religion.
As the Crusaders consolidated their hold on the land around Antioch, a small contingent arrived here in November 1098 under the leadership of Bohemond.
We came to the city named Marat, not far off, in which many Turks and Saracens lived. Bohemond sent an interpreter to the Saracen leaders to tell them if they, with their wives and children and goods, would take refuge in a palace just above the city gates, he would spare them from death. All our men entered the gates, and each of them seized his own share of whatever goods he could find in all the houses and cellars. And towards dawn, everybody was killed.
بعدين فجأة في عام 1099 ظهر جيش أوروبي جاي من فرنسا من إيطاليا. The sources really tell us about the suffering for all the inhabitants. Some of them were really lit in fire, and people were really just fried inside, burned alive inside. Some managed to escape. Of course, they cannot really escape the butchery of the Crusaders, decapitated or knifed 1,000 times. 20,000, 25,000 were really massacred inside the town. Not only the Muslims were massacred, also Christians as well. Not only soldiers, but also children, elderly, women met their violent fate. So it was really a war crime place, kind of an ethnic cleansing.
Treachery followed by massacre had become the calling cards of the Crusader army. But as Christian witnesses revealed, it was what happened after the killing finally stopped that sets the story of Murat al-Numan apart.
The Franks stayed in the city for 1 month and 4 days. And while we were there, some of our men could not satisfy their needs. Either because we were there too long, or because they were so hungry, for there was no plunder to be had outside the city walls. So they ripped up the bodies of the dead, and others cut the dead flesh into slices and cooked it to eat. Our troops boiled pagan adults in cooking pots. They impaled children on spits to devour their flesh.
There is no such thing as a spiritual war. When you fight a war, the aim of that war is to defeat your enemy. They involve violence, they involve threats, they involve propaganda, and they involve, let's put it like this, shock and awe. And the eating of human flesh was designed to strike fear in the heart of the enemy. Here we are strong, we are tough, and if necessary, we'll eat you up alive. And to a certain extent, that succeeded. I mean, there was a wave of horror and fear. They eat us. And if they're eating us dead tomorrow, they might eat us alive.
To the leaders of the crusade, the barbarity that took place at Murat proved that their troops wouldn't tolerate any more delays. The time had come to fulfill their vows and seize the city that had inspired them to risk everything in the name of God. It made no difference that Jerusalem had recently fallen into the control of a far more conciliatory Muslim power, the Fatimids of Egypt, and that they were calling for peace. In June 1099, 13,000 crusaders, less than a quarter of the number that had originally set out from Europe, arrived at the gates of the city where Jesus Christ had died.
When the Crusaders reached the walls of Jerusalem, they finally arrived at their goal. After 3 years, 3,000 miles marching, the most incredible suffering, terrible, terrible losses, they'd arrived at the holy city. Some were so overwhelmed with emotion they wept, others prostrated themselves on the ground. But now, of course, the hardest task of all faced them. They had to break in.
After 3 years of fighting, the Crusader army prepared to attack Jerusalem. The walls were 50 feet high and 10 feet thick. To scale them, they would need ladders and siege towers. But the Muslim defenders had razed the entire surrounding area of trees. The Christians sent out foraging parties to scavenge for wood. Hidden in a hole in the ground, they found 400 pieces of ready-prepared timber. It seemed, once again, God was giving them a helping hand. It was enough timber to build 2 50-foot siege towers with which to attack the walls of Jerusalem. Everything was in place for the final showdown. On the 14th of July, 1099, the Crusaders launched a 2-pronged assault. 2 siege towers were rolled into place, one to the northwest and the other to the south of the city. The Muslim defenders knew if just one tower breached the walls, Jerusalem would fall.
You can look up at these walls and imagine missiles, stones, arrows raining down upon you. The fighting was barbaric and intense, and at one point the Crusaders gave the phrase live ammunition its literal meaning. They captured a Muslim, strapped into a catapult and fired him back over the walls.
To the south, the Muslims pelted the first siege tower with pots of oil and flaming bolts, until finally it went up in flames. Now, only one siege tower was left, to the northwest of the city, under the command of the revered Crusader general, Duke Godfrey.
Godfrey decided upon a change of plan. I've got here an eyewitness account written by a man called Raymond of Aguillet. This is what he said. Godfrey moved to a position between the Church of the Blessed Stephen and the Valley of Josaphat.
Godfrey's plan was inspired. He had found the weak spot in the Muslim fortifications, but it was over a mile round to the northeast of the city. In the course of just a few hours, and under the cover of darkness, he had his men wheel the whole siege tower to the less defended part of the wall.
Here we are, the spot that the Crusaders broke into Jerusalem.
The Muslims mounted one last-ditch attempt to destroy Godfrey's siege tower.
They used grappling irons to try and snare the tower, to use the hooks to catch the wood, and then, remarkably, to pull the thing over. To counter this, the Crusaders had an enormous scythe made that would cut through these ropes. At one moment, there was a brief fire there up on the walls. Godfrey saw this and lowered a makeshift bridge from his tower onto the battlements.
The walls were breached, and the Muslim defenders ran for their lives. The Christians, at last, could seize the holy city of Jerusalem.
We chased the Saracens, and killing them all the way up to Solomon's temple. Before long, its walls were streaming with blood. We killed both men and women, cutting off their heads with our drawn swords. The surviving Saracens dragged the dead bodies out in front of the city gates and piled them up in mounds as high as houses. No one has ever seen or heard such slaughter of pagans. For they burnt them on pyres as high as pyramids. No one knew how many there were. Except God. Jerusalem is ours.
But the fact that against all the odds, seemingly in a miracle, this crusade took Jerusalem and achieved what it had set out to do, that seemed a very clear indication that God's hand was at work, and that its participants and all of Western Europe suddenly thought, this is true. God really does want a crusade to happen. God really is behind this venture.
Almost 3 years after he left his homeland in northern Europe, Duke Godfrey would become the new Christian ruler of Jerusalem. Humbly, he refused to be crowned king in the city where Jesus Christ had reigned.